Orcs, trolls, Balrogs. These are the kinds of creatures that have become synonymous with the dark powers of Middle-earth. But Tolkien, of course, tells us of others, men represented by some of the easterlings, and haradrim, and of course, the dreaded Nazgul. Yet we are also explicitly told of dwarves, who also fell under the sway of evil. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the evil dwarves of Sauron. The idea of antagonistic dwarves is certainly nothing new to Middle-earth. As we've discussed in previous videos, the dwarves of Nogrod would kill the elven king, Thingol, and Mim, the petty-dwarf, would not only betray Turin Turambar, but earlier in his life, he would attempt to kill Galadriel's brother, Finrod. But could there have been truly evil dwarves aligned with the dark powers? Interestingly, in an earlier version of Beren and Luthien's story, Tolkien would imply that the dwarves of Nogrod would betray the titular heroes. As we know from the Silmarillion, Beren would use the knife Engrist to pry a Silmaril from Morgoth's iron crown. However, as he attempts to pry a second Silmaril, the blade breaks, and a shard cuts Morgoth's cheek, causing Beren and Luthien to make a frantic escape with their one Silmaril. However, in an earlier version, Tolkien makes a reference to the dwarves in this moment. Then the knife of the treacherous dwarves snapped, and the ringing sound of it stirred the sleeping hosts, and Morgoth groaned. Terror seized the hearts of Beren and Luthien, and they fled down the dark ways of Angband. Now, some may see this as just a general description of the dwarves as being a treacherous people. However, looking at the timeline of the First Age, the dwarves of Nogrod had not yet attacked Doriath. Could this in fact mean the craftsmanship of this dwarven blade, given to the elves, was made with the intention of breaking? It would certainly make an interesting addition to the history of animosity between elves and dwarves. However, Tolkien tells us quite explicitly that there were dwarves who served the dark powers. In the Silmarillion, as it speaks of the War of the Last Alliance against Sauron, Tolkien says, "All living things were divided in that day, and some of every kind, even of beasts and birds, were found in either host, save the elves only. They alone were undivided and followed Gil-galad. Of the dwarves, few fought upon either side, but the kindred of Durin of Moria fought against Sauron." It's one of the most intriguing lines of all the Second Age. The idea that every type of Middle-earth being was represented on the side of good and the side of evil, with the sole exception of the elves, has some incredible implications. But the dwarves are singled out here. Few are on either side. Explicit proof that there were dwarves loyal to Sauron. But who were these dwarves? Where did they originate, and why did they serve the forces of evil? Fortunately, we know where each clan of the dwarves originated from, and enough of their history that we can make a pretty strong guess. When the dwarves awoke before the First Age, we find the Firebeards and Broadbeams in the Blue Mountains. These would become the dwarves of Nogrod and Belegost, whose exploits, both good and bad, are well documented. Then we have the Longbeards, Durin's folk, who thrive in Khazad-dûm under the Misty Mountains. Finally, we have the Iron Fists, Stiffbeards, Blacklocks, and Stonefoots, all of whom originate in the east. While the dwarves of Nogrod certainly had their issues with the elves, they are never said to have actually allied with Morgoth in the First Age. They always appear to be against the orcs. Likewise, the dwarves of Belegost were great friends to the elves, and fought valiantly against great villains like Glaurung. In addition to this, we are told that by the 40th year of the Second Age, the Firebeards and Broadbeams abandoned their destroyed homes and joined with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Since we know the dwarves of Moria were on the side of good, it's fairly unlikely that the Firebeards or Broadbeams, who integrated with Durin's folk, would fall under Sauron's sway. This leaves us with the dwarves of the East. What do we know about the dwarves of Rhûn? Honestly, not a lot. However, the breadcrumbs we get provide plenty of compelling evidence. Going back to the dawn of the First Age, as the sun and moon rise for the first time, the first men of Middle-earth awake in the East. As we discussed in my video on the early men of Middle-earth, some of them would come into contact with the dwarves near the mountains in Rhûn. And while the dwarves would have some influence on the Mannish languages, it seems not all their interactions would be positive. In the History of Middle-earth volume, The Peoples of Middle-earth, Tolkien talks of some of these early men meeting dwarves in Beleriand, saying, "They were brave and loyal folk, true-hearted, haters of Morgoth and his servants, and at first had regarded the dwarves askance, fearing that they were under the shadow," as they said. Why would these men just meeting the dwarves in the West for the first time be so leery of them? Well, Tolkien goes on to say, "For they had met some far to the east who were of evil mind." Alas, it seems probable that, as men did later, the dwarves of the far eastern mansions, and possibly some of the nearer ones, came under the shadow of Morgoth and turned to evil. So not only would dwarves from the east come under the sway of Sauron at the end of the Second Age, but they may well have been evil for far, far longer. As we know, after the awakening of men in the east, Morgoth personally traveled there to bring men under his control. This foundation is what Sauron builds upon later, as he gains his own hold on the east, particularly among the easterling men. Though now we know there were also dwarves among his ranks. You may be thinking, these are pretty small lines from more deep-cut sources published after Tolkien's death. Maybe he would have abandoned this idea. However, if we go to the very first published Middle-earth book, we will find it was this way from the beginning. In The Hobbit, we read about the orcs. They did not hate dwarves especially, no more than they hated everybody and everything, and particularly the orderly and prosperous. In some parts, wicked dwarves had even made alliances with them. So not only did some dwarves serve Sauron, but they also made alliances with orcs. Now there is an important point to note here. There's no indication that the eastern clans of the dwarves were wholly evil. Indeed, just as we see with the peoples of the haradrim and easterlings, there are those who did not fall under Sauron's sway. The easterlings, as well as the clans of the dwarves, may very well have come into conflict with their own kind over the centuries, as some serve Sauron and others refuse him. In The Lord of the Rings, Frodo meets dwarves traveling through the Shire who had left their ancient homes in the east, as Sauron's final rise to power is underway. These dwarves, fleeing the evil, would seek refuge in the westernmost settlement of the dwarves, the Blue Mountains, which had earlier been re-established by Thrain and his son Thorin. And prior to this, when Durin's folk make war upon the orcs of the Misty Mountains, we are told that the other houses of the dwarves came to join their kin. I believe we can safely conclude that, like the Easterlings, these dwarves of the East had conflict amongst themselves due to the influence of Sauron. Indeed, this complicated nature of these dwarves is hinted at in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, where, speaking of the dwarves, it is said, "They are not evil by nature, and few ever serve the enemy of free will, whatever the tales of men may have alleged." So while men, both the early Edain and those of later ages, would look upon the dwarves with a leery eye, few ever served the enemy of free will. This certainly creates a mysterious and complicated dynamic among the dwarves that may have fallen under Sauron's control. Some certainly did so freely, but most did not. Again, looking toward the First Age, we see many elves captured by Morgoth, made to work as thralls in the pits of Angband. Could Sauron have done similar things with the dwarves? Some clearly fought in the War of the Last Alliance, but could others have been made to use their great skills to forge weapons or even structures within the confines of Mordor? Could some dwarves have chosen or been forced to help build the great fortress of Barad-dûr in the Second Age, or even rebuild it in the Third Age? And perhaps most intriguing of all, does the idea of truly evil dwarves shed new light on Sauron's desire for mithril? I've covered Sauron's coveting of mithril in its own video, so check that out to travel further down this mysterious path of Sauron's aims. But what do you believe? Was it the dwarves of the East who served Sauron? How do you believe this played out among the 4 Eastern clans? Was there conflict between them? And how did the dwarves serve Sauron, aside from battle? Let me know in the comments. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Z and N, Evely, Kia, Freya Firestar, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.